Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. So what is the current state of water in California? What should we expect in the near future? And how will the changing climate impact urban and rural communities as well as agriculture and the environment? Those are some of the questions we'll be asking our guest. He is Jeff Mount, a senior fellow at the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. He's an emeritus professor and founding director of the Center for Watershed Sciences at UC Davis. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So, the PPIC has written that, quote, the 2023 water year provided a case study of California's increasingly volatile climate with large swings between wet and dry conditions, both within and between years, unquote. And you note that California experienced 5 different water episodes during that time. It's pretty amazing. Can you summarize what they were and what it all means?
Well, first of all, we titled this "The California Weather Gods Must Be Crazy." And that's an accurate description. We had basically 5 years worth of weather wrapped into 1 year. Think about it. In fall last year, we were staring down the barrel of the 4th year of very severe drought. By late December and into January, just in a 3-week period, we got a whole winter worth of precipitation in just 3 weeks. It went dry again. People started to panic because it was dry again. And then, my goodness, it turned into a wet spring with record to near record snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. And then for added measure, we had a hurricane, or with the remnants of a hurricane come in and hit the state. So it was a pretty impressive year.
Yeah. So what does this all mean for water and land managers statewide?
Well, this is something to keep in mind. We documented this at PPIC. We're just seeing wilder weather swings all the time in California now. Normal is no longer normal. So you have these wetter wets and drier dries. So from a management perspective, we can't simply be reacting. We have to be planning that every year will be extreme. And so very wet and very dry. And frankly, over the last 20 years, that's the way things have worked. Yeah,
and this increasingly volatile environment. I mean, the gods must be crazy. That really is a great title for what's going on here. This all suggests the need for some big policy and regulatory changes. Are the federal and state governments responding? Is there sufficient funding being allocated to address the emerging water crisis?
So the good news is yes, at both at the federal and state level, there's an acute awareness of this and sort of the beginnings, the most nascent part of response. But we need to completely change our mindset that, again, the weather of the past is not a predictor of the weather of the future. And we have to just adapt to this very wet and very dry conditions. But I want to tell you, everybody's working on this. You don't have to sell this idea anymore.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what the federal government's done, they've got, the federal bipartisan infrastructure law, $3.5 billion. The Inflation Reduction Act, $4 billion. The California legislature is allocated upwards of $8 billion. I mean, that's a lot of money. You start throwing billions around, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, pretty soon that does sound like a lot of money. I will tell you, though, over the long term, we have to sustain that level of funding in order to deal with this. And that is always the problem that we face.
Yeah, it's not a one-off. I mean, it's something you have to constantly be working on. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you kind of alluded to this already, but what's the bottom line here? I mean, how will we or should we be thinking about water challenges, California's water challenges in the 21st century?
Yeah, and that's it. We have to think about it in the 21st century way. That means we got to squirrel away as much water as we can in the wet periods, and then manage our demand for it during the dry periods. This is going to be a constant problem for the rest of this century. I mean, I cannot foresee a future in which it's wet all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like also though our system California's water system wasn't set up for this, right?
No. Yeah, think about it. All our infrastructure is designed around mid-20th century conditions.
Yeah, and so there are some significant changes. Like, groundwater recharge is a good example, right? I mean, we see a lot in the Fresno Clovis area, a lot of recharge basins for flood control, but increasing they're recharging the aquifer. That's becoming more and more important.
It's a big deal in Southern California too. And as this report highlights, we have to take advantage of these wet years, much better advantage of these wet years to help us get through the dry.
Yeah, it's only good if you can retain the water. If we can't retain it, it's not going to help us. Well,
right.
Up next, what are some of the specific implications of having to do more with less when it comes to agriculture, business, homeowners, and the environment? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about the competing demands for water in light of the new realities of a changing climate. Our next guest is Caity Peterson. She's the Associate Director and Research Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks, Mark. Nice to be here.
So how has homeowner and business demand changed in California? I'm just wondering, has it gone up with the growth in population, or gone down, or remained the same? And how much has conservation actually impacted water demand?
Right. So, if we look at population growth since the 1980s, the state's communities and urban areas have actually seen growth by about 10 million people. So it's somewhat surprising when you look at the numbers and see that despite that growth, water use in these communities has remained about the same. So that reflects some pretty significant gains in efficiencies at the household level. Among other things, there's still more room for improvement, especially in outdoor water use, things like watering landscapes. But I think Californians have really embraced that conservation mindset, and they tend to, especially when we're in the midst of a drought. So we saw big gains in conservation during the 2012 to 16 drought, and then again in the 2020 to 2022 drought. We do often see some rebound in household water use after a drought period, but many of those gains in conservation and efficiency are
right. We can finally, the drought's ended, we can finally take longer showers. So we're always worried about that. But actually, when it comes to homeowner use, it's lawns and outside landscaping that really takes up the lion's share of the water. So that's where you're seeing a lot of hardscapes and different kinds of landscaping and certainly new developments. May I ask you this? What about drinking water, drinkable water? That seems to be a particularly big problem in small communities that rely on smaller domestic wells. What needs to be done to address that problem?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, in the previous drought from 2020 to 22, more than 2,000 drinking water wells went dry across the state, and many of those were in rural areas. So under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, otherwise known as SGMA, local groundwater sustainability agencies have to take actions to address those impacts to drinking water wells. But those actions are still really in the early stages. Yeah, local governments are doing their best here, but state support is going to be really critical to implementing.
And it seems like utility consolidation, connection with other water systems is a big answer to a lot of this, upgrades in domestic wells. But 2,000 wells, I mean, that's an amazing number. I want to transition a little bit to another big user of water, and that is ag. You see signs across the valley saying, quote, where, food grows where water flows, unquote. You see that quite a bit. Obviously, water in the valley and valley ag are inextricably linked. So let's talk about water for agriculture. What are some of the unique challenges that ag is going to face in adapting to California's new water reality?
Right. So over the next couple of decades, ag is going to have to deal with dramatically reduced water supplies. And that may be due to droughts that are becoming more frequent and more intense. And it's also due to regulations that are intended to bring water use to sustainable levels. And I'm talking about SGMA again here. So let's remember, California ag is really important for California as a state, as well as for the rest of the nation. But as those signs you alluded to point out, it wouldn't exist in its current form without irrigation. The problem is that for many decades, farming regions have been relying on unsustainable pumping to meet that demand for irrigation, and that's something they won't be able to continue to do indefinitely. Yeah,
but it's interesting in some of the statistics in your report talking about how big ag is in California and nationwide. 12% of all ag production, in California, 70% of the nation's fruits and nuts come out of California. $50 billion annual revenues, employs about 420,000 people. I mean, it's a big deal. So obviously, how do you deal with that? With, because it's so reliant on water. How do you balance that with all the other demands? Which another one we'll talk about now is the environment. There are some implications for the new water reality on the environment. And I guess the first issue is, why should people care? And the second issue is, does the current approach to environmental water management need to change?
Right. Well, as to the first issue, often the question of water for the environment is cast into this false dichotomy. So it's either water for fish or water for people. But the reality is that healthy freshwater ecosystems actually provide an array of important benefits to people as well. There are natural infrastructure that helps manage floods, recharge groundwater, improve water quality. That's before we even get to all the cultural and commercial benefits that these ecosystems provide. As to the second issue, does our approach need to change for managing environmental water? Yes, our current approach really emphasizes minimum flow standards, water quality standards to meet the needs of very particular protected fish species. That sort of neglects the broader ecosystem and those benefits for people that I mentioned. So right now, environmental flows are basically treated as a constraint that dictates what we can do with water management operations. What they need to be instead are a primary management objective on par with water supply, hydropower, flood control, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I actually would encourage our audience to look you up and take a look at some of the work you've done specifically in this area. It's pretty groundbreaking, very, very informative. Up next, the perennial debate about water storage has moved beyond reservoirs. With a more volatile climate, the question becomes, how can we capture and bank more water during those wet years? In short, how do we save water on a rainy day as opposed to when it's not raining? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. A report by the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California notes that, quote, in 2019, all of California's major reservoirs were mostly full by early summer. Yet less than 2 years later, the state declared a drought emergency, with some reservoirs near record lows and groundwater levels once again in sharp decline, unquote. We're talking with Caity Peterson. She's the Associate Director and Research Fellow with the PPIC's Water Policy Center. Caity, things did change in 2023. By late spring, almost all of the major reservoirs were full. And as a result of Sigma, there was significant expansion of recharge basins. What effect do these events have on our ability to store water?
Yeah, that's true. And my colleague alluded to that earlier. Some of the good news coming out of this past year was that folks were really able to ramp up their efforts to get water into the ground and store it in our aquifers. So the Department of Water Resources released some numbers on that, and it's estimated that we were able to capture some 3.8 million acre feet of water by the middle of this summer, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, which is one of the regions where this is most needed. And just for reference, that's about the same volume as Lake Oroville, which is
I noticed that from your report. I didn't understand it until I saw that analogy, and wow, that's a lot of water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so obviously some success in storing water, though more probably could be done. I want to ask you about the governor's role in all this. I mean, he issued some executive orders that had an impact, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely, and you're totally correct that there is definitely more that we could do, and one of the things that could really facilitate more recharge is making the permitting process a little bit easier. And that's what the governor's executive orders tried to do. What they were basically saying is that water managers can divert water for recharge without a permit if there is an imminent threat of flooding, and if they took appropriate precautions regarding water quality. So by the fall, it's estimated that around an additional 400,000 acre feet were recharged as a result of those executive orders. So that's just a really neat attempt to synchronize some efforts to improve our groundwater supplies while reducing flood risks at the same time.
Yeah, just making those administrative changes can have a very big impact. But still, obviously, as you said, more needs to be done. Those efforts to store water have not come without some challenges. Water managers, you note in your report, struggled to take full advantage of this wet year. What are some of the challenges they faced? Why couldn't they do that?
Right. Well, one of the main challenges was just having insufficient opportunities to store water, not enough places to put the water we did have. As you mentioned, our surface reservoirs were full. Meanwhile, we still had plenty of supplies in the system. So we could have captured a lot more water for future use if managers had just had some place to store it. So that was a major frustration this year. There was also Although, as we mentioned, there was a lot of progress on groundwater recharge this year, we really weren't as prepared as we could have been. To do recharge effectively, a lot of things have to line up. There needs to be coordination with reservoir operations. You have to have conveyance infrastructure available to move water from where it is to where it needs to be. Those permits have to be in place, and that can be very time consuming. So there were probably many missed opportunities for recharge because folks were scrambling to coordinate all of that at the same time as dealing with weather emergencies. And finally, I guess we also could have done a lot better on two important areas of need, which, we've already discussed: improving community drinking well conditions and also being strategic about setting aside more water that can be used to support habitat when conditions turn dry again.
Right, this is a system. Everything works together. What you do to one thing affects the other. I did want to note, you were talking about insufficient opportunities to store water, and you had in your report, now I understand what it means, 1.2 million acre feet of San Joaquin River flows could have been captured upstream if some of these changes had been made. And just to put it in perspective, using Lake Oroville again, that's about 1/3 the size of Lake Oroville, just that one issue. So you start to add this up, it really does make a difference. So up next, we're going to talk about, for most of the decade, it seems we've been worried about drought conditions. More recently, however, we've had to pivot to and worry about flooding. What challenges does this flooding pose, and what priorities need to be set to improve the state's response to flooding? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Talk about climate whiplash. In just the span of a year, we went from droughts in 2022 to flooding in 2023. The most glaring example was the return of Tulare Lake, which, prior to California's highly engineered water system, was once the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi River. The result was flooding of more than 100,000 acres of farmland. All told, property damage from flooding cost California an estimated $4.6 billion in 2023. And numerous studies have shown that the risk of significantly larger floods is actually increasing. We have Jeff Mount with the PPIC's Water Policy Center back with us. So Jeff, you note that flood managers faced many challenges. What were they, and what needed changes do they highlight?
Let me start by saying one of the things to keep in mind is they did a pretty good job in dealing with what was a significant flood risk during 2023. But they did a pretty good job with duct tape and baling wire and lots of coordination. We have a flood management system which is just not prepared for these changes that we're seeing. And again, this is, keep in mind, Mark, that our flood generating storms, these atmospheric rivers, are becoming more intense. And when you get, and we fortunately had a lot of snow this last year, that really helped. And we had empty reservoirs, that really helped. But if it were to all happen again this year, when our reservoirs are pretty full and if things were a little warmer, we'd see some major problems. But I want to tell you why I feel like they've got their hands tied behind their back. You have an infrastructure system which was designed around 1950, and much of it even before that. You think of the LA area and a lot of San Francisco Bay Area. So it's old, and in fact, most of the dams are 70 to 75 years or older in the state. So we really have some out-of-date infrastructure that needs some major investments. Think back to the drama of 2017 when Oroville Dam broke. That's a case example for you. The second thing we discovered this year, and particularly in the Tulare Basin, and anybody who followed that closely, there is no plan for the Tulare Basin. There is no regional plan.
Mother Nature has a plan.
Yeah, Mother Nature always bats last. We need that reminder. And Mother Nature decided to rediscover her lake in the Tulare Basin. And so regional flood planning is extremely important. But Mark, one of the things that really came out, and we wrote about this in our report, is the people who have the least ability to adapt when flooding occurs were the most damaged by it. Look at what happened in Pajaro. Look at what happened in the Tulare Basin. Look at in a number of places, even in Southern California. The people who are most at risk are least resilient, and that is these low-income communities, often communities of color. They've been kind of left out of the conversation of flood management for years.
It seems like they don't have the infrastructure, nor they have the technical expertise. Some of these are small towns. One person's the city manager, and they're the jack of all trades, and there's just only so many hours in the day. Let me ask you this: what do you see as the priorities for better wet year water management. Are the federal and state government rising to the challenge here?
Okay, so as I said earlier, and Caity talked about as well, we are making real progress there on trying to deal with these wet years. We have major advances since the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, because people realize we're going to have to harvest more water during these wet years. But we still spend most of our time reacting to wet years rather than planning for wet years. And I think that's the big change. And that is starting at the state and federal government. We got a long way to go. And one of the big things we're going to have to face is investment in infrastructure. And that infrastructure not only reduces flood risk, but also delivers water to places where we can store it. And California does not have, the federal government does not have an infrastructure plan at this point. And that's a major challenge. And that's something we should be working on now. The governor has told his agencies to start planning for a possible wet year this year. He made that as an executive order, but we actually don't have a plan.
Yeah, it seems like first have a plan before you start. What is it? Measure twice, cut once. Probably makes some sense.
So, Mark, I do want to say the one place we do have a plan that is good is the Central Valley. So, starting the San Joaquin River all the way to the north end of the Sacramento, we have the Central Valley Flood Control Plan. You can take a look at that. That's a pretty darn good plan. The rest of the state should model that.
Well, that's a little bit of good news. We've been talking about flooding, but your report is about setting priorities for California water. And that implies that we don't have an unlimited supply of water going forward. So what has to be done for California to live with a limited water supply in the future? And what is California's water future actually going to look like?
So I want to make it perfectly clear. We are not going to dry up and blow away. Much to the chagrin of the New York Times, I find. We are going to be a robust economy into the future, even with these wild changes, and particularly this increasing drought intensification. We're going to be okay. I mean, as Caity just demonstrated, California is pretty good at adapting to all this stuff.
That again, some more good news. I like the way this is ending. I want to thank our guest, Jeff Mount, also Caity Peterson with the PPIC. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for our free newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. Please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.